I've told this story maybe 200 times. At the kiosk, at my sister's kitchen table, once to a journalist who didn't believe a word of it until the photographs came out. And every single time I get to the same part and I have to stop, not because I forget, because I remember too well. People always ask me the same question. Maggie, did he know? Did that guard know what it would cost him when he moved? And I always say the same thing back. He knew. That's what nobody understands. He knew exactly what it would cost. He moved anyway. Let me back up. You need to see the place first, or none of it will land. Weyburn Palace sits at the top of a long gray road called the Kingsway, and if you've ever been to Ashcombe in August, you'll know that road holds heat like a frying pan holds oil. The stone soaks it up all morning and then just breathes it back at you from noon onward. There's no shade. Somebody planted trees along there in the 70s and somebody else cut them down in the 90s, and I've never got a straight answer about why. My kiosk is on the corner, opposite the east gates. Newspapers, postcards, cold drinks, umbrellas when it rains and sunblock when it doesn't. 31 years I've stood in that box. My husband Ron helped me build it out of an old ice cream trailer in 1994, and then he had the nerve to die in 2008 and leave me with it. I know that road better than I know my own face. I know which paving stone rocks when you step on it. I know that the pigeons on the palace railings are not the same pigeons as the ones by the bus stop, and they hate each other. I know that at 11:26 every morning the light comes off the third window on the west wing and hits the postcard rack and fades every card with a sunset on it, so I turn the rack. And I knew the guards. Not their names, you don't get names, but you get faces. You get the way one of them stands with his left shoulder a fraction higher. You get the one who has a mole under his eye that the bearskin shadow doesn't quite cover. There was one I'd been watching for about 6 months by then. He had a scar on his chin, a small white comma just off center, like somebody had started writing on him and given up. And he had this thing I never saw him blink in the rain. Other lads, when it really came down, you'd see them flinch just a little when a fat drop hit them in the eye. Human. Nothing wrong with it. Not him. It could be lashing sideways, and he'd stand there with water running off the peak of his cap into his eyelashes, and he wouldn't move a muscle. I used to think it was showing off. I decided later it wasn't. I think he just decided something about himself, very young, and he was keeping to it. His name was Elias Wren, 23 years old. I didn't learn that until afterwards from a newspaper like everybody else. Now about the standing. People think the guards are decoration. Tourists come up to my counter and they say it out loud, right in front of me, like the men across the road are furniture. Are they real? They ask me that. Genuinely. Are they actual soldiers? My brother Denny served in that regiment. 9 years. So when someone asks me that, I take my time making change and I explain, very politely, what it actually is. They're soldiers. Real ones. They've been places you wouldn't want to hear about at breakfast. And the standing isn't decoration, it's the whole point. A man who can stand still for 2 hours in a wool tunic in August, while 3,000 strangers scream in his face and wave phones an inch from his nose and try to make him laugh, that man will not run when something goes wrong. That's the deal. That's what the stillness is for. Denny told me once over Christmas dinner, and he wasn't drunk enough for it to be a joke. He said, "Mags, the hardest thing they ever taught me wasn't marching. It was learning that the post is not about you. You could be dying and the post doesn't care. You don't leave the post. That's the first thing and the last thing. Everything else is a footnote. If a man collapses in the crowd, you don't leave the post. There are people for that. Police, medics, the sentries who are allowed to move. There's a whole machine behind you, and the machine works precisely because you are the one part of it that does not move. Break it and it's not a telling off. It's not a stern word. It's your career, your regiment, your name gone. Denny said he'd seen a man broken for less. So keep that in your head, keep it right there. because it matters in about 20 minutes' time. Thursday, the 14th of August. The heat that week was the kind that gets into people. 2 ambulances already, before 11. One for an elderly Dutch gentleman who went down by the railings. One for a girl who'd been standing in the sun for 3 hours because she wanted a spot at the front and hadn't drunk anything since her hotel. The crowd was wrong that day, and I said so to Priya, who runs the ice cream van and who I've been arguing with since 1999. "It's too many," I said. "It's August. It's too many for August." She gave me a look, but she thinned her cue out, she noticed too. Because here's the thing, there'd been an announcement, nothing enormous. It had been in the papers on Tuesday in the small type, a walkabout at the east gates. Nothing formal, no carriages, nothing worth crossing a country for. Just a short one before noon, and among the party would be the Princess Elowen. She was 7. And that's what brought them. It was always the little one that brought them. You could have announced the entire cabinet and got 4 men and a dog. Announced that a 7-year-old girl was going to walk 20 meters and shake 9 hands. And by 10 in the morning there were people pressed 6 deep against the barriers, and a queue snaking back past my kiosk, and round the corner onto Fell Street where nobody could even see anything. I'd sold out of water by 9:30. I want to be careful here because I've heard people talk about that child like she was a picture in a magazine. She wasn't. I'd seen her, close up, 4 or 5 times over the years. She had a gap in her front teeth she was self-conscious about, so she'd started doing this closed-mouth smile that made her look faintly disapproving, which was funny because she wasn't. She talked with her hands. She always had a plaster on one knee or the other. She was 7. That's all, that's the whole thing. She was somebody's little girl. The barriers went up at 9. Now, this is one of the details that came out later at the inquiry, and it made me so angry I had to leave the room. The barriers were the standard interlocking type, steel, waist height. They're rated for a certain crowd density. There's a number, and the number is in a document, and somebody in an office is supposed to compare the number in the document to the number of people on the road. The number of people on the road that morning was roughly triple. Nobody's fault exactly. That's what they kept saying. Nobody's fault exactly. The event was small, so it was staffed as a small event. Except the small event had a 7-year-old girl in it, and it was the school holidays, and it was the last hot week of the year. They'd also, and this is the bit that gets me, they'd angled a section of the barrier line at the corner nearest my kiosk to funnel people around a drain that had been dug up in June and not filled in. So you had a pinch, a narrow spot, right where the crowd was thickest. I looked at it at 9:30, sipping my tea, and I thought, that's a bad corner. I have thought about that sentence every day since. That's a bad corner. And then I turned around and I sorted my newspapers. By 11, the noise was extraordinary. I want you to hear it properly, not just crowd noise, layers. Underneath, the traffic on the Kingsway, which never stops, just changes pitch. Above that, the crowd, but a crowd isn't one sound. It's 1,000 conversations in maybe 40 languages, and every so often they'd all rise together for no reason at all, like a wave, and then fall again. Somebody had a Bluetooth speaker playing something with a lot of bass. A child was screaming about wanting to go home and had been screaming about it for 11 minutes. I timed it because I'm not a nice person before lunch. And then the phones. That's a sound most people never notice. 3,000 phones being held up. It's not silent. It's this little constant tick and rustle of hands and sleeves and cases. And through it all, every so often the crunch. That's the guards. When one of them comes to attention or turns, that iron-shod boot goes down on the stone and it makes a crack you can hear over everything. It's not loud. It's sharp. It cuts through the way a whistle cuts through. Wren was on the box nearest the east gate. Scarchin. I'd seen him take up post at 10. He'd been standing an hour in that heat, in that wool. with that bear on his head. I remember watching a fly land on his cheek and walk right up under his eye and off again, and he might as well have been carved out of the same stone as the palace. Somebody in front of him was doing the thing where you stand next to a guard and pull a face at the camera. Somebody else was singing. A man in a Manchester shirt had been trying for 20 minutes to make Ren laugh and had run out of material and was just saying "mate" at him, over and over, sadly, like a man calling a dog that has died. Ren looked at nothing. Straight down the road, past all of them, at some point about 200 yards away that only he could see. At 11:31 the gates opened. The noise doubled. Just doubled instantly, like someone had put their hand on a dial. Every phone went up at once, and the light off all those screens made a sort of shimmer over the crowd. The royal party came out on foot. 6 of them, plus the protection officers you could spot immediately if you knew what you were looking at. The ones in suits with their hands loose and their eyes on the crowd instead of on the family. The princess was on the left, near the barrier line, holding on to the sleeve of a woman I'd seen 100 times and never once got the name of. She had on a yellow dress. She had a plaster on her left knee. She was doing the closed-mouth smile. They started along the barrier. Handshakes, flowers. A little girl handed over a drawing and Aloan took it with both hands and said something and the crowd went "ah," the way crowds do. It was lovely. I'm not going to pretend it wasn't. Even after everything, I remember thinking, standing in my box with my hands on the counter, this is lovely. They were about 15 meters from the bad corner. At 11:37 and about 20 seconds, 160 meters away, on the far side of Wren Park, an underground junction box that had been flagged for inspection in 2019 and inspected in 2021 and passed, went up. It wasn't a bomb. I need you to understand that, because for about 90 seconds nobody on that road knew it wasn't a bomb, and everything that happened inside those 90 seconds. It was a transformer, a gas buildup in a service tunnel, they said, in a report that came out 8 months later and that nobody read. It blew a manhole cover 30 feet in the air, and it took out the windows of a dry cleaners, and it did not kill a single person. But the sound, I've never heard anything like it. I hope I never do again. It wasn't a bang. A bang is a firework. This was I've tried for years to describe it. It was a thud that you felt in your sternum before you heard it in your ears. It came up through my feet, through the floor of the kiosk, and rattled the postcards on their wire rack. And then half a second behind it, the sound of glass. A lot of glass, a long way off, going on for much longer than you'd expect glass to go on for. And then a smell, hot metal and something chemical. The pigeons went up off the railings all at once, all of them, in one gray burst. And 3,000 people stopped making noise. That's the part nobody believes. The silence. It couldn't have been more than a second and a half, and it was total. 3,000 people, and I could hear a car alarm going off 2 streets away. Then it broke. I've read about crowd crushes since. I've read more about them than is good for me. And every account says the same thing, which is that a crowd does not run. Not really. That's the myth. A crowd in a confined space cannot run because there's nowhere to run to. What a crowd does is push. The people at the back heard a bomb. The people at the back could not see anything because they were on Fell Street, round the corner, 6 deep. They heard an explosion and they smelled burning and they saw pigeons, and they did the only sane thing a human being can do, which is move away from it. 300 people at the back of the crowd took 1 step away from the noise. And that 1 step traveled forward through the whole crowd like a wave through water. And by the time it reached the front, at the pinch, at the bad corner, at the barrier line that was rated for 1/3 of the people leaning on it, it wasn't a step anymore. The barrier didn't fall. That's another thing people get wrong. It didn't fall over dramatically. Two sections came apart at the joint, and one of them turned slowly, almost politely, at an angle into the gap where the drain had been. And the crowd went into that gap. I was out of the kiosk. I don't remember opening the hatch. I remember my hip hitting the counter and the pain of it arriving about a minute late. I remember Priya's ice cream van, and Priya, standing on the step of it, screaming at people to go back, and the people at the front of the crowd were trying to go back. They were fighting to go back, and it made no difference whatsoever because there were 2,000 people behind them who could not see. I saw a man go down and get up. I saw a pushchair get lifted straight up over people's heads and passed backwards, hand to hand, which is the single most decent thing I have ever seen human beings do, and I never found out who started it. The protection officers had the family. That was fast. That was very, very fast. I'll give them that till the day I die. 3 of them closed on the group like a door shutting, and they were moving them back toward the gate, all of them, in about 4 seconds. All of them except one. She'd let go of the sleeve. That's it. That's all it was. Somewhere in the noise, in that first second and a half of silence, a 7-year-old girl in a yellow dress had let go of a woman's sleeve and turned around to look at where the sound came from. And the crowd came over the barrier. I lost sight of her. I want to be honest with you about that because in the newspaper version, I never lose sight of her. In the newspaper version, I am standing there watching the whole thing like it's a film. I lost sight of her for what I have always thought was about 4 seconds, and what the timestamps say was 11. 11 seconds. There were bodies going down in the gap where the drain was. That's a hole in the road, that's a foot deep, covered in a steel plate, and when the barrier turned, people started going into it and going down and not getting up, because there were people coming behind them and there was nowhere for anybody to go. Somebody's shoe went past me on the pavement, just a shoe on its own spinning. And a woman was shouting one word over and over, and it took me a moment to hear that it was a name, and it wasn't a Lowen. It was some other child, somebody else's, because there were dozens of children in that crowd, and every one of them belonged to somebody. I want to tell you about Ren now. Because for all of it, the thud, the glass, the pigeons, the silence, the barrier, for all of it, he had not moved. I'd looked at him. Twice. I remember it clearly because it made no sense to me. The world had come apart and there was this man on his box, rifle at his shoulder, chin level, looking down the Kingsway at his 200-yard point that only he could see. The bear didn't move. His hands didn't move. And I thought in the middle of everything, with a kind of fury I've never felt before or since, do something. I didn't understand, not then. I understand now and it's worse. He was doing his job. His job in that exact moment in the middle of what might have been a bomb was to be the fixed point. Because if the guard on the gate runs, everyone runs. Because there is a whole apparatus of trained people whose job is to move, and precisely one man whose job is to be the thing that doesn't. The stillness holds the shape of the thing. Take it away and there's no shape at all. He would have been able to see her. That's the part I can't get past. From that box, elevated over the heads of the crowd, he had the only clear view of that corner of anyone alive. He'd have seen the barrier turn. He'd have seen where she went. And he stood there, and he did not move, because there were protection officers and there were police and there was a system. And the system was already working. And everything he had been taught since he was 19 years old told him that his job was to hold his post and let the system do its work. For 11 seconds, that man watched a system fail. At some point in there, I got knocked down. I don't know by who. I went onto one knee on the pavement and someone's bag caught the side of my head and my glasses went, and I was 59 years old and on the ground in a crowd, which is a thing that will teach you the meaning of fear very quickly. A young lad with a rucksack picked me up, both hands straight up like I weighed nothing. He didn't say anything and he didn't stop. He was already turning to pull somebody else. and I never saw his face properly, and I have thought about him nearly as often as I've thought about Ren. And when I came up, I was facing the wrong way. I was facing back down the road, toward the corner, toward the gap. And that's when I heard it. You have to understand what the volume was at that moment. Screaming, car alarms, sirens starting far off, Priya still shouting, 2,000 people all making noise at once, and the flat grinding sound of a crowd moving against itself, which I did not know had a sound until that day and which I have never forgotten. And through all of it, thin and high, and about 4 feet off the ground. Help. One word. Not a scream. That's what did it. That's what I still hear at 4 in the morning sometimes. It wasn't a scream. A scream is what you make when you're frightened. This was the sound a child makes when she has been polite her entire short life, when she has been raised to be composed in front of people, when she has been told what to do in a crowd and has done all of it and it has not worked. It was the sound of a little girl asking, properly, for help. And then again and smaller. Please help. She was down. She was down in that gap with the drain plate, and she was under people, and she was 7 years old, and she weighed about 3.5 stone. I want to say I went for her. I would like, more than almost anything I can name, to tell you that I went for her. I couldn't get through. There were 40 people between me and that corner, and they were all pressed solid, and I was screaming her name, and I could not move 1 single inch. Nobody could get to her, except from one direction. Behind me, up on the wall of the palace, a window opened, and a woman started shouting instructions nobody could hear. Ahead of me at the corner, a hand came up out of the crowd and went down again. And to my left, 12 feet away, on a stone box, a 23-year-old man with a scar on his chin stood at attention with his eyes fixed on a point 200 yards down the Kingsway, in a wool tunic in the heat, holding a rifle, on a post that his regiment had held without a single break for 211 years. I turned my head and I looked straight at him. And I saw his jaw move. That's all, just once. That little clench you do when you're about to say something you can't take back. Then he blinked twice fast. Then his eyes came down off that far point, for the first time in an hour, and traveled across the crowd and stopped at the corner. And I watched his hands change on that rifle. He knew what it would cost. That's what nobody understands. 211 years and a career and a regiment and a name. He knew. And I heard, under all that noise, over on my left, one sharp crunch of an iron-shod boot coming off a stone box onto the road, that crunch. I've spent years trying to explain to people why that particular sound is the thing I remember, out of an entire morning of screaming. I think it's because it was the only ordinary noise left. Everything else that day had become something else. The crowd wasn't a crowd, the road wasn't a road. But that sound was exactly the sound it had always been. A boot coming down on stone. The same crunch I'd heard 400 times a week for 31 years, at 10 in the morning when the centuries changed. Except it was coming off the box instead of onto it. And it was going the wrong way. He didn't run. I want to be extremely clear about this, because the papers said he ran, and the papers were wrong, and it matters. He came off that box and he went into the crowd at a walk, a fast walk, rifle held across his body, both hands horizontal at about chest height. I didn't understand what he was doing with it until later, when a man from the fire service explained it to me, and I had to sit down. He was using it as a bar. He wasn't clearing people. He was spreading them. That rifle went across 3, 4 people's backs at a time, and he leaned into it and he took the pressure off the ones in front, and the ones in front breathed, and he stepped in, and he did it again. Denny told me afterward there's a name for it. Some technique for moving through a press of bodies without adding to the crush. He said it's not something you're taught for crowds. It's something you're taught for other situations, worse ones, and he wouldn't say more than that. It took Ren 9 seconds to cover 12 feet. 9 seconds. I've stood in my kitchen with a stopwatch and tried to feel how long 9 seconds is when a child is under people. It's forever, that's the answer. It's absolutely forever. Here is what I could see, and here is what I couldn't. I could see the bearskin, that's it. That's my whole view of the most important 30 seconds of my life. A black shape, taller than everybody, moving through the top of a crowd like a shark fin. I couldn't see the ground. Nobody could see the ground. That was the entire problem. That's why it happened. In a crush, the ground stops existing. The bearskin stopped at the corner. It went down and out of sight, and I made a noise I'm not proud of. Then it came back up. And then something happened that I still don't fully believe, and I saw it, and I'm the one telling you. The crowd went backwards. Not much. A foot, maybe 18 inches. But it went backwards into itself, against the direction of every bit of force in that road. And it did it because a man in a red tunic had put his back against the barrier post and braced his boots and shoved a rifle horizontally into 200 people and held them off. For 19 seconds, according to the timestamps, he held a hole open in the crowd with his own body. And in that hole, on the steel plate over an unfilled drain, a woman I have never been able to identify. She was in a green cardigan. She had a bag over her shoulder. She was in none of the photographs, and she never came forward, knelt down, and got both arms under a 7-year-old girl and stood up with her. That's the truth of it. He didn't carry the princess out. He never touched her. He made a space, and a stranger did the rest, and that's the part that never fits into a headline. Then the sirens arrived and the road opened up and the pressure came off all at once, the way it does, like a not letting go. And everything after that is just noise and running and the strange, awful ordinariness of an emergency. I got to the corner about a minute later. I stepped on a hat. There were 11 people on the ground. 9 of them got up in the next few minutes. One man was taken away with a broken pelvis and lived. One woman, she was 64, she'd come down from a village I'd never heard of with her sister. They'd got tickets for a garden that afternoon. She didn't. I'm not going to use her name here. Her family have had enough of hearing it in stories that aren't about her. But I want you to know that she was there. Because when people tell this story, it becomes a story about a guard and a princess, and it stops being a story about a road where a woman died. And I've never been able to do that, and I've stopped trying. The girl was on her feet. I saw her maybe 40 seconds after at the gate in the arms of one of the protection officers, and this is the detail that undid me, she was trying to tell him something. Talking. Urgently. Hands going the way she did. She was telling him about other people. She was 7 years old and she'd been under a crowd, and she came up out of it trying to tell a grown man that there were other people down there. The plaster on her knee was gone. She had a graze on her cheekbone the size of a coin, and she'd lost one shoe. Just a shoe on its own. And Ren walked back to his box. He came out of that crowd with his tunic torn at the shoulder and his bearskin gone. It came off in the press. They found it later, kicked under a barrier, and blood coming down from somewhere in his hair, and he walked back across the road through all of it. He didn't look at anybody. He didn't look at the girl. He stepped up onto his box. He turned, face down the kingsway. Rifle to his shoulder, chin level. And he stood there, bareheaded, torn, bleeding in front of the wreck of that morning, and he did not move. There is a photograph, you've seen it probably. Everyone has. It ran in about 90 countries. The man who took it was an insurance clerk from Ashcombe who'd bunked off work to see the walkabout. And he took it because he was crying too hard to think of anything else to do with his hands. Ren stood that post for another 40 minutes, until his relief came. Nobody relieved him early. That's the thing that tells you what the men around him already understood. There was a police inspector standing 8 feet away who could have ordered him down and didn't. He was relieved at the proper time, on the proper words. And then 2 officers from his own regiment walked him through the gate, one on each side, and the gate closed, and that was the last anyone saw of Elias Wren for 4 months. I need to talk about what happened next, and it's the part people don't want to hear, so they skip it. He was charged. I'll say it again, plainly, because I've had people stand at my kiosk and refuse to believe me. That young man was charged with leaving his post. Not maliciously. Nobody wanted it. I've since spoken to a colonel, a genuinely decent man who was, I think, ashamed, and he explained it to me with a kind of tiredness in his voice. He said, "Mrs. Pell, if we do not charge him, then the next time a soldier decides he knows better than his orders, he has a defense, and the time after that, and one day it will be a man who is wrong." He said the rule exists because men are brave, not because they aren't. And I sat in that man's office and I hated him, and I understood him at the same time, which is a horrible thing to have to do. So there was an inquiry. 4 months. In that time, Wren was in barracks, not suspended exactly, doing whatever it is they give a man to do when nobody knows what to do with him. He gave no interviews. He was offered, I know this for a fact, a sum of money for his story that would have set him up for life, and he said no, and he never told anybody he'd said no, and it only came out because the journalist eventually wrote about being refused. The papers went mad, petitions, 600,000 signatures, a morning television program did a phone-in. A retired general wrote something furious in a broadsheet about how the regiment had lost its soul. And through the whole thing, not one word from Wren. I hated that too for a while. I wanted him to defend himself. Then I realized he was still standing his post. That's what he was doing. That was the only way he knew how to be a person. The world screaming and the man silent. I gave evidence. 9 minutes, in a room with a long table, in front of 5 people, and I'd rehearsed for 2 weeks and forgot every word of it. They asked me what I saw. I told them about the barrier and the corner and the drain. I told them the crowd number. I'd got the crowd number from a man at the Transport Authority who told me over the phone and then asked me not to say where I got it, so I said I'd read it somewhere, and I'm sorry about that, but I'd do it again. Then one of them, a woman, gray bob, reading glasses on a chain, and she asked it perfectly kindly, she said, "Mrs. Pell, in your opinion, was there anybody else who could have reached the princess?" And I said no. She said, "Are you certain?" And I said, "Madam, I was 11 feet closer to her than he was, and I couldn't move my arms." Nobody said anything for a moment. Then a man at the end asked me if I had seen the guardsman hesitate. And I thought about that jaw, that one clench, the 2 fast blinks. And I said, yes, for about a second and a half. He wrote it down, and I said, and this wasn't in my rehearsal, this came out of me sideways. He hesitated because he knew what it would cost him. If he hadn't known, he wouldn't have hesitated. That second and a half is the only reason you should believe he's a good soldier. The woman with the gray bob took her glasses off. He was found to have breached his standing orders. That was never really in doubt. He had. Everyone knew he had, including him. The finding was that no further action should be taken, on the grounds that the circumstances were exceptional, and that the systems which should have protected the crowd had failed in a manner which, and I have this bit by heart, because I've read the paragraph so many times, in a manner which no reasonable standing order could have anticipated, and which the soldier, uniquely, was positioned to observe. He was returned to duty. He was also quietly, and this was never announced, moved. A different posting out of Ashcombe. I don't know where, and I've never tried to find out. There was talk of a decoration. There were letters in the papers about it for a while. It never happened, and I think I know why, And I think it's because a medal would have been the state saying we are glad he broke the rule, and they could not say that, and they were right not to say it. So instead there is nothing, there is no medal. There's a photograph of a bareheaded man on a stone box with blood in his hair, and there's a road with a filled-in drain, and that's the whole of it. Things changed. That's the strange, quiet legacy of it, and it's the bit that nobody makes a film about. The barriers on the Kingsway are different now. They're a different system entirely, they lock. And there's a marshal every 15 meters in a yellow vest whose only job is to watch the density at the pinch points and radio a number every 4 minutes. The drain got filled in 11 days after. 11 days. It had been open since June. There's a training module now in 3 different services built around what they call the Weyburn Gap. Denny's seen it. He says it opens with a diagram of that corner and the caption is a single question. Who has the only clear view? Because that was the finding underneath the finding. The one the papers never printed because it doesn't fit on a front page. A system had been designed on the assumption that the man on the box would never need to be listened to. He had no radio. He had no way to tell anybody what he was watching. He had the best view of that entire road, and the arrangement of the world was such that the only way he could communicate what he was seeing was to step off the box and do it himself. They gave the guards radios after that. Small thing. Nobody wrote about it. I think it's the most important thing that came out of the whole business. 2 years later, a letter came to my kiosk. Handwritten, no return address, postmarked somewhere I'd never heard of. It was from him. I'm not going to tell you everything it said. I've never shown it to anybody except Denny and my sister, and once, to a young woman who came to my counter in a state I recognized. And I let her read it and she gave it back, and she went off down the Kingsway a different shape than she'd arrived. But I'll tell you the last bit. He said he'd read what I'd told the inquiry, about the 2nd and a half. He said I'd got it slightly wrong, and he wanted to correct me, because he thought I'd been carrying something for him, and he didn't want me to carry the wrong thing. He said he didn't hesitate, because he was weighing up his career. He said he hesitated because for that 2nd and a half he was trying, as hard as he had ever tried at anything, to see somebody else moving. A police officer. An officer of his own. Anybody. He said he stood there and he looked at that corner and he thought, someone will go, someone is going, they're going now. And nobody went. And he wrote, so it was mine. 3 words, that's it. Then he thanked me for the water. I'd apparently given him a bottle of water once, on a hot day, years before, through the railings, and I have absolutely no memory of it whatsoever. She's grown now. Alone she'd be, well, she's not 7 anymore, put it that way. She's tall. She's had the gap in her teeth sorted out and I miss it, which is an absurd thing for a stranger to feel. She gave a speech last year. Not about that day. About something else, some charity, a hall full of people. And near the end she went off her notes for a moment, the way she does, hands going, and she said something about how she had been taught, growing up, that the point of duty was that you performed it whether or not anybody was watching. And she said she'd learned, quite young, that this wasn't quite right. She said the point of duty is that you perform it, and then one day it asks you for something it was never supposed to ask for. And what you do in that 2nd and a half is the only true thing anybody will ever know about you. She didn't say his name. She's never said his name, not once publicly, and I'd bet this kiosk she knows it perfectly well. I watched it on the little television I keep by the crisps, in my box, on the corner opposite the east gates, with the postcards fatting behind me. I still work that road. I'm 68. My hip's never been right since the pavement. Priya sold the van to her nephew and he's changed the recipe and I've told him so. The guards still stand there. New lads. One of them's got a laugh in him he can't quite hold down and I give it a year. And every so often a tourist leans on my counter and nods across the road and says it, right in front of me. Are they real? And I take my time making change. And I tell them they're real. And the standing isn't nothing. The standing is a promise. It's a man saying with his whole body, hour after hour, in the wet and the heat, I will be here. Whatever happens, I will be exactly here. And then, if they're still listening, if the queue's short and the light's coming off the third window, I tell them about a Thursday in August, and a bad corner, and one word, not a scream, just a word, asked politely, 4 feet off the ground. And I tell them about a man who kept that promise for 211 years worth of tradition and an hour of his own life, until keeping it would have cost a child hers. He knew what it would cost. That's what nobody understands. He looked at that corner. He waited a second and a half for someone else to go. And when no one did, he stepped down off the only safe place in the world, and he broke the one rule he had, because there was a smaller, older rule underneath it that no army ever had to write down. They never gave him a medal. But I'll tell you what he got instead, and I think, knowing him, he'd say it was the better bargain. He got to walk back to his post, bleeding, bareheaded, with nothing left of his career but the next 40 minutes, and stand there like a man who could look himself in the eye. And in 31 years on that road, that is the only time I have ever seen what a uniform is actually for.